What if a single, unexpected encounter on a quiet Los Angeles street had the power to change two lives forever? What if a chance moment of compassion forced a Hollywood icon to confront the fragile line between success and despair? When Keanu Reeves spots a frail figure huddled on a cold sidewalk, he's unprepared for the shock of recognizing his former theater teacher, the very woman who once sparked his passion for acting, now homeless and forgotten. Why did life lead her here? And more importantly, can he help her find her way back? This is a powerful story of redemption, resilience, and the incredible impact one person can have when they refuse to walk away. Dive into a journey where kindness becomes the catalyst for a life forever changed. Join us in reflecting on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are what. Ching from We would love to hear from you. Keanu Reeves was cruising along a quiet Los Angeles street in the early hours, the steady rumble of his Norton Commando 961 echoing through the stillness. The city was mostly asleep, a faint haze hovering above the asphalt. Keanu had just wrapped up an event, an arts education fundraiser, a cause that resonated deeply because he credited much of his own confidence to the theater classes he'd taken years ago. As he rolled past shuttered storefronts and flickering streetlights, something made him slow down. He spotted a small figure huddled on the sidewalk, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, head bent low. Homelessness in L.A. was tragically common, and normally he'd simply feel sorrow at this everyday reminder of a broken system. But this time, a sense of urgency gripped his chest. Something about this person's posture or the tilt of their shoulders nagged at his memory. He coasted another few meters, then pulled over, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. Shutting off the engine, he removed his gloves and helmet. The stillness that followed was almost eerie. With careful, deliberate steps, he approached the figure. The closer he got, the more certain he became that he recognized her. In a soft voice, he called out, "Ma'am." The woman stirred, lifting her face as though every movement caused pain. The moment Keanu saw her eyes, his world came to a halt. The lines of her face were etched with hardship, her hair dirty and tangled, but he couldn't mistake her. It was Mrs. Collins, his old theater teacher. Years ago, she had been a fierce, passionate instructor who coaxed the shy teenage boy out of his shell, demanding that he project his voice and inhabit each character he played. Shock coursed through him. He sank to one knee, removing his leather jacket to drape it over her shivering shoulders. "Mrs. Collins," he managed, his voice choked. She blinked, eyes glassy, and whispered his name as though she couldn't quite believe it. In that instant, her frailty became unmistakable. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pallid. She leaned forward, struggling to maintain balance. Keanu caught her just as she nearly toppled, alarm flashing in his eyes. "Let me help you," he said urgently, glancing around the deserted street. He realized he needed to get her somewhere safe and warm, but he had no idea if she'd even be able to walk. She parted her lips to speak, but then her eyes fluttered closed in exhaustion. Terrified she might be seriously ill, he eased her gently back against the wall, shielding her from the biting cold. After a minute, she resurfaced to a fragile consciousness. Her dull gaze flickered with recognition, and she spoke his name again, shakily. Keanu squeezed her hand. "It's really me," he affirmed. The shock of seeing her like this was almost too much to bear. In his mind, she was frozen in time, forever that dynamic teacher with a piercing voice and a fiery determination to see her students succeed. Now she was on the street, vulnerable and seemingly alone. "Mrs. Collins, what happened to you?" The question spilled from his lips before he could stop it. She looked at him with a haunted expression, as though the memories hurt more than the physical cold. For a moment, her lips trembled, and he thought she might explain. Instead, her head fell forward again, and her body sagged. Keanu, fighting back a surge of panic, steadied her. He'd encountered all sorts of adversity in his life, loss, grief, the harshness of public scrutiny, but nothing prepared him for finding a person so important to his past, left this broken. He took a deep breath, scanning the street for any sign of help. Only a couple of passing headlights illuminated the darkness, and no one seemed to pay attention. "Stay with me," he pleaded softly. "I'm not leaving you here." He weighed his options. Call an ambulance, try to find a shelter, drive her somewhere himself. But in that moment, she stirred, blinking in confusion. "Keanu," she rasped, her voice cracked from the chill night air. "Why? Are you here?" He offered a gentle, wry smile. "Because you taught me never to walk away when someone needs help. Remember how you always said that theater is about empathy?" Her expression quivered, as if part of her couldn't bear to be seen this way. She coughed weakly, swallowing as though it hurt. I tried. I truly tried," she whispered, her eyes closing for a moment. He couldn't decipher all the layers behind that statement. Tried to keep her life together, tried to escape this fate, tried to hide from everyone. "We need to get you somewhere warm," he said, voice resolute. When she didn't protest, he carefully helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, leaning heavily on him. The motorcycle wasn't an option. She could barely walk, let alone ride. His mind raced for alternatives. "I'll be right back," he promised, easing her back down so she could rest against the wall. Bolting across the street, he found a phone booth, one of the last relics of old L.A. still standing. Fumbling for his cell phone might have been easier, but anxiety drove him to the nearest immediate solution. He called for a rideshare pickup large enough to carry her, ignoring the pang of guilt at leaving her alone for even a moment. By the time he jogged back, she was shivering, eyes distant. He crouched beside her, draping his jacket once more around her shoulders, wishing he could do more to shield her from the harsh world. "Help is on the way," he said, voice gentle but firm. She nodded absently, as though unsure if she could trust hope anymore. In the dim glow of a distant street lamp, he glimpsed the depth of her despair. He realized that tonight would be just the beginning of a complicated journey back into a past he'd never fully confronted, and that in helping her, he might learn more about the roads that had led them both here. Within minutes, an older sedan pulled up to the curb, headlights illuminating the patch of sidewalk where Keanu knelt beside Mrs. Collins. The driver eyed the scene warily. Keanu stood, gently supporting his former teacher. She wobbled, her strength seeming to vanish with each step. With great care, he guided her into the back seat, sliding in beside her. "Thanks for coming," Keanu murmured to the driver, who glanced at him in the rearview mirror with puzzled recognition. Perhaps the driver's eyes flickered in surprise at seeing a famous actor in such circumstances, but thankfully, he asked no questions. As the car rolled toward a more central area of Los Angeles, Keanu tried to glean information from Mrs. Collins. She was conscious but appeared emotionally numb. "Did you lose your home?" he asked softly. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "Do you have any family nearby?" At this, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she was reluctant to talk. Keanu suspected there was pain stacked beneath the surface, layers of regret, shame, and maybe anger. The last time he'd seen her, she was strong and unyielding. An educator who refused to let budget cuts or skeptical administrators steal the beauty of live performance from her students. How had she gone from championing art in local schools to living on the street? He recalled her distinct way of commanding a stage, her voice reverberating with unwavering passion. Now, she hardly spoke above a whisper. "I try to find work after they cut the theater program," she finally admitted, her voice trembling. "Private lessons, odd jobs. Nothing lasted. Nothing ever fixed it." Keanu gently placed a hand on hers. "You don't have to explain everything now," he said, sensing her exhaustion. But a glimmer of relief crossed her features. Someone was listening. He directed the driver toward a nearby all-night cafe, deciding it would be a safer, warmer spot where they could figure out the next steps. The bright neon sign of the diner cut through the darkness, a small haven of light in an otherwise empty stretch. Once parked, Keanu helped Mrs. Collins out of the car, paid the driver a generous tip, and led her inside. The interior was modest, with chipped vinyl seats and a scattering of night owls hunched over steaming cups of coffee. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm. He guided her to a booth in the corner. She sank onto the bench, shoulders slumping with fatigue. A weary waitress approached, pen at the ready. Keanu ordered 2 coffees and the heartiest meal they offered. Mrs. Collins stared at the table, expression unreadable. When the drinks arrived, she clasped her hands around the warm ceramic mug like it was a lifeline. She lifted the cup to her lips and sipped, eyes shutting for a moment, as though letting the heat thaw more than just her body. Keanu watched silently. He wanted to ask so many questions. How had she ended up alone? Where were her children? He remembered her mentioning 2 kids long ago. Why hadn't she reached out to someone for help? But he sensed she needed space. She was like a cornered animal, raw and wary of any approach. It was heavy with guilt. He met her gaze gently. It's not about responsibility, Mrs. Collins. It's about gratitude. You inspired me when I was that nervous kid trying to remember monologues. You're the one who always said theater is about empathy, about embodying the human condition. You taught me how to feel fully. How could I not be here for you now? She looked away, tears threatening to form, but she blinked them back. It's been a long time since anyone called me Mrs. Collins, she murmured. That person feels like a different lifetime. He paused, letting her statement settle. It pained him to realize how far she had drifted from the life she once led. What shall I call you now? He asked gently. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. Ruth, she said, her voice tentative. Most people, they just call me Ruth these days. He nodded. All right, Ruth. Let's figure out how to get you somewhere safe. She stared at him with a flicker of defiance. I've tried shelters. Some turn you away if they're full. Others have rules that make you feel less than human. You give up after a while. You stop believing in second chances. The waitress returned, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs and toast across the table. Keanu slid it closer to Ruth. Eat. Then we could talk about next steps. Hunger trumped her pride. She picked up the fork, taking small bites, as though her stomach had forgotten how to handle real food. The sight nearly broke his heart. He realized she might not be ready to trust anything or anyone, but that didn't matter. He would not walk away. When she'd eaten about half, she pushed the plate aside, exhaling shakily. So, she said, gathering a tattered blanket closer around her shoulders. Where do I go from here? Keanu clasped his hands, leaning forward. First, you need a rest. I'll pay for a room tonight. He saw her flinch at the idea, but he pressed on. Just until we can get you some more stable support. Tomorrow morning, I can call a resource center that might help you find counseling. Job referrals, a more permanent place to stay. She shook her head, eyes darting away. I'll only disappoint you. His tone was soft but firm. Let me worry about that. For a moment, they locked eyes. Her fear was evident, but beneath it, Keanu glimpsed the spark of the strong teacher she once was. He took a steady breath. He didn't know if he could fully save her from the demons she faced, but he did know he wouldn't let her endure them alone. And in the back of his mind, he wondered what revelations were yet to come, both about her fall from grace and about his own capacity to help. They left the cafe just as the earliest hint of dawn touched the sky. Keanu hailed another ride, guiding Ruth, Mrs. Collins, in his mind, into the back seat. With each careful movement, he sensed the profound fatigue in her bones. She was too thin, her steps unsteady. But at least she was marginally warmer now, still draped in his jacket and holding on to the old blanket. As they drove through dim streets, she stared out the window, silent. Her hair, once neatly styled back in the day, hung limp around her face. Keanu considered the memory of her standing on a high school stage, commanding attention. He remembered how she'd challenge him if he slouched or if he failed to project his lines, always pushing him to become a better performer and a more empathic person. He finally broke the silence. Is there anyone I can call for you? Family, friends. Ruth shook her head almost instantly. It's complicated, she murmured, her voice drained of emotion. They tried to help at first, but it never stuck. I made too many mistakes. He had the drive. The receptionist eyed them with curiosity, but said nothing. Once in the small room, Ruth sank onto the edge of the bed, letting out a tremulous sigh. Keanu placed a bottle of water on the side table, along with some leftover food from the cafe. Try to rest, he urged gently. I'll be back in a few hours. We'll figure out a plan. She nodded, looking apprehensive but too exhausted to argue. Her hand trembled as she pulled the blanket closer. You really think there's a way out of this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu met her gaze. I do, but I'll need your trust. Ruth closed her eyes for a moment, then nodded. All right. Stepping outside, Keanu took a long breath. The morning sun now lit the parking lot with a pale glow, revealing the chipped paint and unremarkable exterior of the motel. It wasn't much, but at least it provided a roof, a locked door, and a functioning heater. He felt a familiar twinge of guilt. He had the resources to live comfortably, while one of his most influential mentors had slipped through society's cracks. How could this have happened without anyone noticing? He knew well how precarious life could be. He'd had his own share of tragedies and hardships, but fortune eventually shone on him. It hurt to see how easily a person could be cast aside, especially someone who had poured so much into others. At midday, after making a few phone calls, Keanu returned to the motel. Balancing a paper bag filled with fresh clothes, simple sweatpants, a t-shirt, some toiletries, he knocked on the door. A moment later, Ruth opened it. She looked slightly better, though dark circles lingered under her eyes. The blanket was still draped over her shoulders, but the trembling had lessened. You're back, she said, sounding almost surprised. Of course, he replied. I brought a few things. He extended the bag, and she accepted it with a hesitant nod. While she disappeared into the bathroom to change, Keanu glanced around the room. It was sparse, but relatively clean. He noticed a crumpled napkin on the bed with a scribbled phone number, perhaps a shelter's hotline or a place she'd tried. The sense of her isolation bore down on him. When she emerged, the t-shirt and sweatpants fit loosely, but the simple act of wearing clean clothes seemed to restore a small measure of dignity. She folded the old blanket, setting it aside. Thank you, she whispered. Keanu inhaled, not wanting to overwhelm her. I spoke with an outreach program. They help people get into counseling, find job leads, or transitional housing. We can go check it out. Her expression tightened. I've gone through some of those systems before. They never ended well. Too many forms, too many questions, too many rejections. I'm tired, Keanu. He understood her skepticism, but he pressed gently. Maybe this time will be different. You're not alone now. You've got me, and whatever resources I can bring. She sank back onto the bed, gaze flickering to the window. That's what scares me. Letting someone help. A wave of empathy rushed over him. You spent so many years helping kids like me, he said, stepping closer. What would you tell me if I were in your shoes? For a moment, the old Mrs. Collins surfaced, the teacher who had once guided him with unwavering determination. She looked at him with a tinge of sternness. I'd tell you to swallow your pride and accept the hand offered. He spread his arms slightly. Then heed your own advice. Let me do this. Let's go tomorrow. She exhaled slowly, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Tomorrow, she repeated, nodding. Over the next several hours, they talked in cautious increments. Keanu suggested she rest, but Ruth insisted on filling him in on the basics. How she'd stayed afloat for a while by tutoring young actors in private lessons. How an unexpected illness drained her savings, and how she'd eventually slipped through society's safety nets. People stop seeing you as a person, she murmured, eyes shining with unshed tears. You become an eyesore, a cautionary tale nobody wants to confront. He listened, feeling a profound ache in his chest. I'm sorry I wasn't there sooner, he found himself saying, though he knew it was unrealistic to think he could have known. She patted his arm gently. Don't. You're here now, and that's more than enough. Night fell again, and Keanu assured her that the room was paid for a few more nights if needed. He handed over a slip of paper with his number. Call if you need anything. I'm serious, no matter the time. Her hand curled around the paper as though it were a lifeline. All right, she said softly. I won't run this time. I promise. Satisfied, he took his leave, determined to make the next day count. He had no illusions that a single outreach program would magically solve all her problems, but maybe, just maybe, it would spark a shift in how she saw herself. Tomorrow, they'd take that step together. Morning dawned with a muted LA sunrise filtered through thick smog. Keanu arrived at the motel armed, with 2 cups of coffee and pastries. He knocked on Ruth's door, bracing himself for the possibility that she might have vanished in the night. To his relief, she opened the door, looking marginally better rested, though anxiety still shadowed her eyes. I brought breakfast, he said, holding up a paper bag. She nodded, letting him step inside. The room felt a little less bleak in the daylight, but it remained a stark reminder of her predicament. They sat in the motel's lone chair and on the edge of the bed, sipping coffee. Ruth took a tentative bite of a croissant, then set it aside. My stomach's not used to this much food, she admitted. Self-conscious. Keanu simply nodded. Eat what you can. No ruse. He understood that small steps were crucial, physically and emotionally. After breakfast, they headed to the outreach center. The drive was quiet, her nerves almost palpable. If this doesn't work, she began, staring out the window. No ifs, Keanu said gently. One step at a time. The building was modest. A plain exterior with a small sign indicating it was a community resource hub. Inside, a few other individuals waited in plastic chairs. A volunteer welcomed them, handing Ruth a clipboard stacked with intake forms. She hesitated, pen trembling in her hand. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, and she nodded, steeling herself to fill in the blanks. Name, date of birth, address. She had none. Family contact, health conditions. While she labored over the paperwork, Keanu spoke quietly with a coordinator named Jackie. He explained Ruth's background, though he kept details minimal out of respect for her privacy. Jackie nodded sympathetically, assuring him they'd do everything possible to help. This included access to therapy, job referrals, and possibly a transitional housing placement if she qualified. When Ruth finished, she glanced at Keanu with an uncertain expression. All these forms, I've done this before. He held her gaze. I know, but this time, you've got someone in your corner. The coordinator asked a few gentle questions. Ruth responded hesitantly, voice wavering when the topic veered toward her children and her teaching history. Keanu noticed a haunted look in her eyes when she mentioned them, but he didn't press. Jackie simply thanked her for sharing and promised to contact her as soon as a program slot opened. Outside, Ruth wrapped her arms around herself. Now what? We wait. Keanu shrugged. We keep trying. One day at a time, right? He thought about offering to pay for her long-term motel stay, but worried it might make her feel beholden. Instead, he said, we can look for a small place. Something short-term, with rent I can cover. Until you're on your feet. She turned to him, raw vulnerability etched into her features. I don't want to live on charity. He sighed. You gave me more than charity back when you were my teacher. You gave me courage, discipline, faith in my potential. Let me return the favor in some form. Please. Her resistance melted a little. Thank you, she whispered, tears threatening. I'll try not to let you down. Keanu gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You're not letting me down. You're just living one step at a time. They spent the afternoon together, discussing how she might rebuild. She expressed a shaky interest in teaching again, maybe small theater classes or even private coaching for children. Keanu lit up at the idea. I might know some folks who'd be thrilled to have you consult on kids' productions. Let me make a few calls. That evening, as they left the outreach center, Ruth paused on the sidewalk, breathing in the crisp air. The city lights glimmered, forming a stark contrast to her darkest memories of these streets. She turned to him. Why do you care this much? He blinked. It's not just about caring. You shaped a part of who I am. Every time I stand on a set or recite lines, I remember your voice telling me to feel, to connect. You believed in me before anyone else did. If I can give even a fraction of that back, I have to. Her eyes glistened in the fluorescent glow of a street lamp. For the first time, He sensed the wall of shame she'd built around herself was cracking. "You always were too good for Hollywood's cynicism," she murmured, half smiling. In the days that followed, a small routine formed. Keanu continued covering the motel cost, ensuring Ruth had warm meals. He arranged for a medical checkup, discreetly paying for medication a doctor prescribed for her lingering ailments. He also spent time calling old contacts and local theater groups, hoping someone might be willing to let an experienced teacher like Ruth help with workshops or auditions. Slowly, her spark began to reappear. She laughed once or twice when he recounted funny moments on his film sets. She corrected him on breathing techniques when he imitated her old lessons. Still, shadows lingered in her eyes. Late at night, she'd fall silent, pulled into her own regrets. On one such evening, she finally spoke about the children she'd mentioned. "They tried, she said, voice wobbling. "My son had me stay with him, but I hated being a burden. It felt humiliating, so I left on my own. I told them I was fine. It was a lie." Keanu listened intently. "Did they stop reaching out?" She shook her head. "They kept trying to call. Eventually, I changed my number. I gave up on myself, so I assumed everyone else should too." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I was wrong." He laid a comforting hand atop hers. "Maybe it's time to let them know you're still here." She looked away, ashamed. "I've been gone so long. What if they hate me for it?" "Families can be messy," he admitted softly. "But if you don't open that door, how will you ever know?" She inhaled deeply, then nodded, though fear still rippled across her face. It was clear that reconciling with her children would be a difficult journey. Yet now there was a possibility, something that hadn't existed before. By the end of the week, the Outreach Center found a short-term spot in a women's shelter willing to accept Ruth. With Keanu's silent financial backing, she was guaranteed a bed and guidance for the next steps. The day she moved in, he helped carry a small bag of belongings, neither of them speaking much, but the air between them felt lighter. She hugged him unexpectedly, gripped tight. I never thought I'd get this far." "Thank you. You're strong, Ruth," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Don't forget it." And as he watched her step inside, he felt a surge of pride and relief. Still, he knew her trials weren't over. Recovery from that level of despair was no straight path, and he'd be there for whatever came next. Several months, yet she was fighting, and that was new. She stayed in touch with Keanu, meeting up weekly for coffee. Sometimes, they'd stroll through a park or visit a small local theater, feeding her old passion for the stage. It wasn't just her living situation that had changed. Little by little, she regained her sense of self. Through therapy sessions arranged by the Outreach Center, she started unpacking the fear and shame that had weighed her down. She even ventured to connect with her adult children. They were hesitant at first, hurt, confused, but after many heartfelt conversations, they opened a cautious path toward reconciliation. One afternoon, Keanu invited Ruth to a community children's theater he had quietly helped sponsor. Walking inside, she heard the echo of young voices rehearsing lines, the scuffle of sneakers on a wooden stage, the earnest hush before a scene began. Instantly, her eyes lit up with a flicker of recognition. This was the world she once inhabited. A cluster of kids, no older than 10 or 11, stood in a circle trying to project their voices. But then she took a tentative step forward, clearing her throat in that authoritative way Keanu remembered so well. "Let's see if we can bring those lines to life," she said, voice still harboring that crisp precision of a dedicated teacher. The kids perked up, intrigued by this newcomer. Over the next hour, she guided them through simple warm-ups, encouraging them to embody their roles fully, to feel each word. It was as if she'd slipped into her old self, the confident director who once ignited Keanu's passion for acting. Keanu observed from a distance, heart swelling. This was the woman who had changed his life, and now she was back in her element, if only for an afternoon. The kids giggled, overcame nerves, and even performed short scenes with surprising depth. Ruth corrected them gently, offering praise where it was due, forging that teacher-student bond with sincerity and warmth. Afterward, as the children filed out, Ruth lingered on stage, her gaze drifting over the rows of empty seats. Keanu approached quietly, standing by her side. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he asked softly. She closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of paint and dusty curtains. "Better than I remembered," she admitted, her voice tight with emotion. "This is what I lived for, helping young people find their voice. I lost it somewhere along the way." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You found it again, and it's stronger than ever." In the weeks that followed, the volunteer director invited Ruth back multiple times. She began assisting with small theater workshops, later expanding to help older teens prepare for local auditions. The outreach center gave her enough stability to manage daily life, and Keanu discreetly ensured financial shortfalls didn't derail her progress. Meanwhile, she rebuilt bridges with her family. On a sunny morning, Ruth walked into that same community theater with a purposeful stride, wearing simple yet neat attire. Gone was the tattered blanket, replaced by a quiet determination. She spent the day coaching a boisterous group of preteens. Their first performance was around the corner, and the set buzzed with frantic energy. She reminded them to project, to convey emotion, to trust themselves. It was like watching a conductor orchestrate a symphony of budding talent. Keanu stopped by after filming a brief cameo elsewhere in the city. Standing at the back, he watched her commanding the stage, the kids hanging onto every tip she dispensed. When the session ended, they scampered off, excited to show their parents how much they had learned. Ruth stepped down from the platform, wiping her brow with a satisfied smile. "Long day," she remarked, though she looked energized rather than tired. Keanu reached out for a high five, and she obliged with a cheerful laugh that echoed in the empty theater. "You're making a real difference," he said, recalling how many times she told him the same years ago. She glanced around, soaking in the environment. "I never thought I'd be here again," she admitted, voice thick with gratitude. "I owe you so much." He shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. You saved me first, just returning the favor." They locked eyes in mutual understanding, a current of respect flowing between them. It was never just about debt or obligation. It was about genuine human connection, about stepping in when someone stumbles and remembering that hope can flicker back to life at any moment. A few days later, the children's play premiered. Friends and family crowded the small venue. Cameras. Keanu arrived inconspicuously, but a few parents recognized him and exchanged excited whispers. He took a seat in the back row, watching as the lights dimmed, and the young actors emerged in a swirl of color. From the first line to the final bow, their performance radiated the spark of genuine passion. They might have been novices, but they performed with heart, a testament to Ruth's guidance. When the curtains closed, the applause thundered through the small theater. Some of the kids cheered, hugging each other with glee. Ruth discreetly wiped away tears, stepping out from behind the curtain to share a moment in the spotlight with them. Standing up to join the standing ovation, Keanu felt a rush of pride that nearly overwhelmed him. This was a triumphant return, an embodiment of what second chances could accomplish. The teacher who had once believed in him when he was an uncertain teenager was now seeing her own belief restored. It might have begun with a single desperate encounter on a lonely sidewalk, but it culminated here, on a stage overflowing with promise and hope. That night, after the last of the families departed and the theater lights clicked off, Keanu and Ruth remained behind for a moment. They stood in the center aisle, surrounded by the echoes of the children's final bows. Neither spoke at first. Then Ruth exhaled softly and turned to look at the stage. The dusty beams and scuffed floors no longer reminded her of loss and missed opportunities. They shone with the potential for renewal. "You never gave up on me," she said, finally breaking the hush. "Not even when I'd already given up on myself." Keanu offered a gentle nod, remembering the chilly sidewalk where he first found her. Huddled in despair. "I just did what you taught me all those years ago. Step into someone else's shoes, feel what they feel, and act with compassion." In that moment, the weight of everything she had endured seemed to lift, replaced by the steady knowledge that she had a home here, among people who valued her gifts. She no longer needed to stand in the shadows. Surrounded by the silent props and costumes, it was clear her story was far from over. "Thank you," she whispered, a tear catching the faint glow of the exit sign. Keanu tucked his hands into his jacket pockets. "I should be thanking you," he replied, voice warm. "All of this, it wouldn't exist if you hadn't believed in me first." They shared a quiet smile, then walked out side by side, leaving the darkened theater behind. In the crisp night air, Ruth allowed herself a small laugh. She felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in years. Hope